On to that big talking point at the moment now, there's been the new proposals for the implementation of the so-called two-pot retirement system. Treasury has now proposed that the new system take effect from March 2024. The two-pot system will comprise a savings pot, which will receive 1/3 of the contributions and will be accessible in the form of one withdrawal from a minimum of R2,000 a year. A retirement pot will receive 2/3 of those contributions and will be accessible only on retirement. Joining me now to talk about this is Senior Policy Advisor at the Association for Savings and Investment South Africa, Rosemary Lightbody. Thank you very much for your time this evening, Rosemary. Now, I mean, it's important to highlight that there were many concessions that were made by National Treasury in their presentation as to why this has to be pushed out even more. But for a number of years now, many South Africans have called on the system to be put in place simply because they've been desperate to access some funds without having to resign.
Yes, we are obviously very grateful and very pleased to see that the implementation date Treasury agrees that it certainly cannot be 1st March next year. And in fact, they have decided that they're going to propose that it should be 1st March 2024, as you say. But, much as people, members of funds, want to get money out of these funds immediately, it's simply not possible to implement all of the administration and to do all of the things that need to be in place in time, even by 1 March 2024. And the reason for this is that, as you say, a lot of extra concessions were made by Treasury, which we perfectly understand. For example, initially, immediate access was not going to be allowed. Members were going to have to wait for the 1/3 savings pot to build up, and then they would take out of it once a year. Now, seeding, they call it seeding, which means that as an amount from what you've already built up by implementation date, you will be able to access some of that money. They are also agreeing that it will be fair that if on retrenchment, members are allowed to access the money, because their earlier proposals were that on retrenchment, you would not be able to access any more than the savings pot, and they're conceding on that. Now, we understand completely why they would want to address those needs, but what it does is it adds more elements into the complexity that it has to be drafted into the legislation. It's not in the draft legislation. So not only does the current legislation have to be clarified and resolved, but these new aspects that are being introduced have to be drafted up and fully understood. Other things that they have agreed need to be drafted into the legislation is how defined benefit funds are dealt with, like the Government Employees Pension Fund, which the original draft didn't adequately cover. Certain old retirement annuity funds were not properly catered for, well, not really catered for at all. Also, they've conceded that the Pension Funds Act needs to be amended, and there's a raft of other drafting improvements that are absolutely necessary before it's totally certain what the intention is and the intention is made clear. So on top of all these drafting changes that have to be made, there are now new complex aspects that have been introduced, and it is going to take 18 months from finalization of the legislation for all of this to be put in place.
So, Kasatu,
I think it's also very important.
Please continue, Rosemary.
So it's very important. No, I was just going to say that I think it's terribly important to realize that the most important people in all of this are the fund members. So once everything's made certain, they are going to have to be communicated with, and it's so important that they should understand exactly what this is all about, what choices they're going to have to make, and what the implications of those choices are going to be.
So realistically then, Rosemary, for those members that are watching and have been waiting to access some of those funds, what time frame are we looking at? Because we might get to March 2024, and like you say, because there's so many details that need to be ironed out, we might get to March 2024 and realize that there are still a few things that need to be ironed out. As an organization, realistically, what would you advise people to expect in terms of the time frame?
It's very difficult to answer that because Treasury was actually asked in Parliament today what their timeline was to finish all of the things that need to be done. And their response was that they don't have a hard and fast timeline because a lot of consultation around the new provisions that are being introduced that weren't there before still has to take place. Legislation has to be drafted, as I said. There was a suggestion by Treasury that they will have completed everything by March 2024, which is one thing. But once they've completed everything and there's certainty and the final legislation is published, only then can boards of retirement funds, can fund administrators start looking at what systems need to be changed and how, because a very slight difference can make a big change to the way the system has to be implemented and what processes have to be put in place. And the last thing you want is to send educational messages, communications out to fund members and then have to turn around later and say, actually, no, the final legislation said something different. Because you really don't want to confuse members. So your communication has got to be very, very clear. The two-pot system is going to be more complicated than the current system. It's going to have much better outcomes for members, we believe, on retirement, because that's what retirement funds are primarily for, to provide for you in your retirement financially. It is going to be complex. It is going to take time to introduce, but it will be worth it. But the big concern is rushing all of this is going to cause confusion and lack of trust in the system and a lot of bitterness. We're very, very concerned about that. We would love to be able to flip a switch and say, okay, the minute the legislation is finalized, flip the switch, everything's operational.
Yeah.
But sadly, it just doesn't work like that.
No, it doesn't. And of course, you and I will continue with this conversation. Rosemary Lightbody, who's the Senior Policy Advisor at Asisa, joining us this evening. Sally will be back with more of your news after the break.